The desert night held its breath. 3 men in an alley. One of them very large, the other 2 not finished yet. Then a sound, not the wind. Boot heels on packed dirt, moving toward the trouble instead of away from it. A woman, alone, carrying something that caught no light. The pick handle stopped mid-swing. 4 seconds of silence that felt like a verdict. Somewhere in Rimrock, a lantern burned in a diner window. On the counter inside, an envelope, thick paper, expensive ink. The 4th one this month. Each one more certain than the last that the answer would change. It hadn't. Outside, the 2 men ran. Inside, a widow looked at what the night had dropped at her door, 6'4" of battered stranger, a faded mark on his lapel, where a lawman's star had once been pinned, and made a decision that would cost her everything she had left to lose. She let him in. She was burning the 4th letter when she saw them. The envelope caught fast, the way Warren Cole's paper always did, thick stock that flared orange before it went black, and the small heat of it pushed back against her fingers on the porch railing. She was watching the last corner curl when the movement at the far end of Main Street pulled her eyes left. 3 shapes in the alley mouth past Morrison's dry goods, one of them very large, the other 2 in the postures of men who are not yet finished with what they started. She knew the sound before she understood she was hearing it. That specific dull percussion of something heavy, connecting with something that could not hit back. Once. A pause that meant nothing good. Again, the burning paper dropped onto the porch boards. She stepped on it without looking down and went inside. The shotgun lived on 2 wooden pegs left of the broom, and she had not taken it down in 4 months. But her hands found it in the dark, the way hands find things they have practiced finding. Thomas had made her practice. Not because he thought she would need it, he'd said, but because the only thing worse than needing a thing unprepared was having time beforehand and wasting it. She broke the gun open in the kitchen doorway light, confirmed what she already knew about the chambers, and snapped it closed and went out through the side door that opened on the alley side of the building. The wind was moving east to west, which put her approach downwind of all 3 of them. She came around the back corner of the livery at the alley's mouth and stopped, 10 feet. Would you treat them with kindness? The large man had gone to one knee, which meant they had landed something significant, and the one with the pick handle was bringing it back for the swing that settled questions permanently. Both of you. Her voice came out level. She had not arranged for it to be level. It simply was, the way certain things become simply true after enough years of practice. Rimrock doesn't keep a doctor within 40 miles. Either of you wants to test me. Go right ahead. The one with the pick handle stopped mid-arc. The circling one took 2 automatic steps backward, which was the body making a smarter calculation than the brain had finished running. They looked at the woman-shaped shadow, holding something that caught no light, because it was wood and iron rather than anything reflective, and they looked at each other, and the arithmetic resolved itself in approximately 4 seconds. They ran. Not sprinting, not panicked, just the purposeful departure of men who have revised their evening plans and see no value in lingering to discuss it. She watched them go until their footsteps faded past the east end of the alley, and then it was just the wind and the man on one knee between her and the back wall of Morrison's. He was trying to stand. Not waiting for assessment, not asking for assistance, just working the problem of vertical with the focused patience of someone who had been knocked down before and had developed a reliable method. He made it. Swayed once. Found his balance in the careful way that people find balance when 2 or 3 ribs have weighed in on the situation. And she could see him then, see the actual scale of him, which was considerable enough that she recalculated the number of men it would have required to put him on one knee. 6'4" was not rare in the territory. But this was not the lean economy of range work or the ropey toughness of men who covered ground on foot. This was the kind of size that settles into itself over decades of hard use and stops performing and simply becomes what it is. His face, in the thin light from the street, was somewhere north of 40. The kind of age that lands differently on men who have spent it outdoors doing things that matter to them. On the left lapel of his coat was a rectangle of slightly different color, where the fabric had been shielded from sun and weather for years by something no longer there. She knew that shape, the specific dimensions of it. Thomas had worn one for 11 years. You can walk? She kept her voice the same, practical. The question needed a practical answer, and nothing else from either of them right now. I can walk. His voice was what happened when gravel decided it had said everything worth saying about being gravel and settled into itself. Low, deliberate, containing even now, with one eye already beginning to close, a quality of choosing rather than simply producing. Then walk inside before you finish the job they started. She turned and did not wait to see if he would follow. She had asked the question and gotten the answer, and the rest was his business. She heard his boots on the side step 30 seconds later. He had to angle his shoulders to come through the doorway, which she noted without comment. She had seen that doorway accommodate Thomas, who was not a small man, with room remaining. She lit the large lamp over the work counter and got the tin basin and the clean rags from the second shelf and the carbolic from behind the flour, and she set them on the table and looked at what the evening had produced. The cut above his right ear needed cleaning. The eye would do what eyes did when struck directly, which was swell dramatically, and then subside over several days with a color progression that was unpleasant to observe but self-resolving. The ribs were the real question. She pressed 2 fingers along the left side, with the particular attention of someone who has done this before, watching his face rather than her hands for the information that mattered. His jaw tightened in a specific way at the 3rd intercostal space. Nothing else moved. 2 cracked, maybe a 3rd one making up its mind. She reached for the linen. I'm going to wrap them. It helps less than people expect, but it helps some. I've had worse. Not complaint, not boast. Just information offered in the interest of accurate mutual understanding. I imagine you have. Hold still. She worked without unnecessary conversation. The lamp made the kitchen warm against the March night coming in under the door. And outside the wind had picked up further and was doing its work on the northeast corner of the building, where the adobe had a gap Thomas had been meaning to fill the winter he died. She had filled it herself the following spring. It still held, but she checked it every fall, the way you check the things that mattered to someone who is gone. Not because they asked you to, but because the checking is how you keep the conversation going. She tied off the bandage and stepped back. He was looking at the photographs on the wall above the stove. She had seen people look at those photographs before, customers who knew Thomas or knew of him, and she had learned to read the quality of the looking. This was not the polite interest of a stranger. This was recognition settling into something more complicated. Thomas in his deputy marshal's coat, standing straight with that particular expression he had in photographs, the slight impatience of a man who felt that the time spent holding still for a camera was time that could be better used. Thomas and Clara, at the station's front door in what must have been the summer of 1873, her arm through his, the new sign still showing bright paint that had not yet had a season to weather into itself, and in the center, largest, Thomas on his horse reckoning, laughing at something off to the right, with his hat pushed back and his whole face open in the way it rarely was when he was being observed. The man at her table looked at those photographs with an expression she had no clean category for. Not grief, which had more of the self in it, something quieter, the expression of a person who recognizes a weight they have carried themselves, and is measuring it against someone else's version. Reed's Station, he said. The way a person says the name of a place they have been saying in their head for a while. Thomas built it in 72. She was putting the basin away, not looking at him. He died in the spring of 75. A pause with thinking in it. I know the name, Thomas Reed. He said it with the careful specificity of a man confirming something against an internal record. Texas border. March of 71. I was running a supply theft job that had gotten complicated the way they do when the people stealing decide they'd rather shoot than be caught. There were 4 of them working the far end of the canyon and 2 of us on the near side. He stopped, moved his cup a fraction to the left and back without appearing to notice he was doing it. The math was wrong from the start and got worse at the end. Your husband was the reason I walked out of that canyon and they didn't. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove doing its slow work and the wind outside finding the places in the building it knew about. She turned from the shelf and looked at him. He never mentioned it, she said. This was true and also not the complete thing she meant, which was that Thomas had not been a man who kept inventory of the times he had been useful to someone. He did what the situation required and moved to the next thing. The accounting was not something he engaged in. He wouldn't have. The man looked at his hands on the table, large hands, the kind that had been worked hard enough for long enough to show it permanently, regardless of what they were currently doing. What's the name? She understood he meant his own introduction, offered late because the sequence of events had not allowed for the conventional order. Clara Reed. Buck Calloway. He looked up. I owe you an apology for the circumstances. You owe me nothing of the kind. You owe those two men considerably better manners. She sat down across the table because her feet had decided on it, and she was tired enough to let them make decisions. Why are you in Rimrock, Mr. Calloway? Heard there was work for someone who knows cattle and fence lines. He said this directly, with the quality of a man who is telling the truth and aware that the truth is not complete. Both of these things were visible to her simultaneously. Thomas had been a man who was very honest, and also sometimes left edges unaddressed because the edges seemed less urgent to him than they did to others. And 11 years of living with, that had calibrated her for exactly this frequency. Those three men. Didn't know them, but they knew you. He looked at her steadily for a moment that ran long enough to contain an answer without requiring one. Then, apparently, she folded her hands on the table and looked at the man sitting in Thomas's kitchen at 9:30 on a Tuesday in March, with 2 cracked ribs and a closing eye, and the specific quality of someone carrying something heavier than whatever was in his saddlebag. She thought about the 4 letters. The tin box under the back room floorboard with $48 in coin that did not add up to what spring required. The well housing that Thomas had dug himself in the summer of 1869 before there was a station, or a sign, or a single other building on this stretch of what was now Main Street. The well that now served most of Rimrock, and that Warren Cole had been trying to own for 6 weeks through escalating varieties of polite threat. You can sleep in the back room, she said. The cot is narrow, but it is a cot. I won't put an injured man out at this hour, and I won't hear argument about it. He opened his mouth. The argument can wait until morning. She stood. Blankets on the left shelf. When you go in, the door latches from inside. She blew out the kitchen lamp and left him with the smaller one, and went to bed and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling that Thomas had plastered himself in the fall of 1872, with more ambition than experience, which was why the northeast corner still had that slight irregularity that she had stopped seeing years ago, and now only noticed when something made her look at the ceiling directly. She thought about the letters. 4 of them in 6 weeks, each one more precisely worded than the last, each one more expensive in its paper stock and its penmanship, as though Warren Cole believed that sufficient quality of presentation would eventually make the answer change. The first had been a business proposition, the second a generous offer, the third a generous offer with what Ginny Stone, when Clara had finally described it to her, called an unusually frank acknowledgement of alternative scenarios. The fourth, the one Clara had been burning when the evening changed direction, had contained a single sentence that she could still read perfectly in her memory. I find that I am no longer able to maintain my patience in this matter, and trust that you will reflect carefully on what that means for your situation. She had burned it because burning it was what she did, because the ash was easier to look at than the paper, because Thomas would have understood that, and probably would have done the same thing for different reasons, namely, that he would not have wanted anyone in the station to see the letter and start asking questions she was not yet ready to answer. She had burned it. She knew it was the wrong choice. She would not get another chance at it, and the evidence it represented was gone into the stove, and she was aware of this every hour of every day since she'd done it. $48 in coin in the tin box. She had built this place alongside Thomas, not metaphorically. She had mixed adobe and carried lumber and held the level while he checked the plumb on the door frames, and she had opened the station for breakfast on April 3rd of 1872 with 6 customers, and Thomas sitting at the far end of the counter eating the same biscuits she had made for the paying customers, because that was the kind of man he was. She had poured coffee every morning since then, except the 3 weeks after he died, when Ginny Stone had run the breakfast service herself and refused to discuss payment. She was not going to lose it to a man with expensive paper and a smile that arrived slightly ahead of everything else on his face and left slightly after. She was just not entirely certain yet how she was going to prevent it. The ceiling showed her nothing useful. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind work its familiar route around the building, and eventually she slept. She woke at 5:15 to the smell of coffee. This required processing. She had not started coffee, and she was alone in the station except for the man in the back room, and she sat up and confirmed that yes, that was the specific smell of Reed's station coffee, which was stronger than most people's. Because Thomas had liked it that way, and somewhere in the middle of their marriage, she had simply adopted the preference without deciding to. The way you absorb things from people you live closely with until the line between their habits and your own becomes unclear. She dressed and went to the kitchen. He had found the coffee and the pot and the particular temperament of her stove, which was not intuitive and took new people time. And he was sitting at the end of the counter with 2 cups, poured, and the stillness of a man who had been awake considerably longer than she had. The bruising around his eye had begun its color work. He held himself with the slight careful economy of ribs that had delivered their assessment overnight. She sat, drank. The coffee was right. You didn't have to. Observation, not gratitude deflection. No, same register. Just a fact. They drank in the quiet of 2 people who have arrived at an arrangement and are not yet certain of its terms but are not uncomfortable with the uncertainty, which was its own kind of information. She needed to start the biscuits. She needed to start it. She needed to think through what she was going to say to Ginny Stone, who had been asking about the letters since the second one and who deserved more than the partial answers she had been receiving. She set her cup down. The men last night, they were a message, most likely. He was looking at his cup. Warren Cole is the name I'd put to the sender. She watched him when she said the name, not performing the watch, just paying attention the way Thomas had taught her to pay attention when something mattered. He's been trying to purchase this property for 6 weeks. He's made 4 offers, each one more pointed than the last. She paused. Last night may have been the transition from pointed to something else. Buck Calloway's face did not change in any way that was visible and precise, but something in the quality of his attention did. The way a very still surface registers something moving beneath it before the surface shows any change itself. Warren Cole. He said it with the particular care of a man trying a key in a lock he is not certain fits. You know him. He looked at her with steadiness that contained more than it released. I know a name that sounds like it, or might be it. He stopped there. She did not push. She had learned the difference between a person withholding because they intended to deceive and a person withholding because they had not yet finished the internal work of deciding what they were certain enough to say. The second kind deserved the space the first kind did not. The front door opened, not knocked. Warren Cole walked into Reed's station with the ease of a man for whom the concept of permission had simply never taken hold as relevant to his own movements. He was dressed as he always was. Vest pressed, boots clean despite the spring mud, hat held at exactly the angle that communicated both good breeding and confidence in the impression it made. He brought 2 men, which was new. Silas Ford at the left of the door, where he usually positioned himself, and a second man she did not know who took the right side and stood there in the way that objects stand rather than people. Cole came to the counter, looked at Clara, then looked, with a slightly longer assessment, at the man sitting at the far end of the counter with a closed eye and a cup of coffee, and no expression at all. Cole was very good at reading rooms. She had observed this. The slight recalibration in his posture when he looked at Buck told her that Buck was not the kind of room he was accustomed to reading easily. Mrs. Reed. Spring morning pleasant. I see you have an early visitor, customer. She did not look at the envelope he set on the counter. She knew it was there. Reed's station serves everyone, naturally. Cole's finger rested on the envelope for a moment, and then moved it a precise distance toward her side of the counter, as though the distance itself communicated something about the transaction's inevitability. I hope you'll give this one more consideration than you've given my previous correspondence. The figure inside reflects my genuine appreciation for what you've built here, and my sincere hope that we can reach an agreement that serves you well. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the envelope, walked to the stove, opened the firebox, and placed it on the coals. She'd not watch it catch. She turned back to the counter. For the first time in 6 weeks of interactions, something moved through Warren Cole's face that was not the smile, and was not the careful pleasantness. It moved quickly and the smile returned, but it returned with perhaps 3% less structural confidence than it had carried a moment earlier. And she noticed this the way she noticed things that mattered. You'll find that particular decision difficult to revisit, he said. Still pleasant. The pleasantness doing more visible work now. I expect I will. She held his eyes. Was there anything else this morning, Mr. Cole? He looked at her. He looked again at Buck Calloway, at the end of the counter, who had not moved and had not spoken, and had simply continued to exist in the kitchen, with his coffee and his closed eye, and his expression that gave Cole's considerable skill at reading people nothing useful to work with. Warren Cole, who made his living knowing exactly what leverage he held over exactly which people, was looking at a man he could not yet place, and a woman who had just burned his fifth letter in front of him, and the combination was producing something in his face that the smile was working hard to cover. Rimrock is changing, he said. The warmth in his voice was still present, but it was performing more effort to stay there, the way a fire performs more effort when the wood starts running low. The people who understand that early tend to find themselves on the right side of what comes next. I'd like you to be one of those people, Mrs. Reed. I genuinely would. He left. Ford and the second man followed without looking at her. The door closed. Ezra McIntosh, who had been in his corner booth since 6:15, and who had not moved or spoken during the entirety of it, raised his coffee cup and turned a page of last week's newspaper and said, to no particular destination, a man who smiles that much at breakfast is hiding something bad for digestion. Buck Calloway looked at the old man in the corner, then at Clara behind the counter. Something was happening behind his eyes that she could not yet name, but recognized in the way you recognize the opening movement of something significant. She brought the biscuits out, served Ezra, poured Buck a second cup without asking, and began the work of the morning because the morning required it, regardless of what the stove had consumed and regardless of what the day was likely to bring next. By 9, the breakfast crowd had moved through, and she had served 14 meals, and signed the Burkett brothers' petition about the North Road grading, and had a conversation with Mrs. Morrison about the quality of the spring flower coming up from Las Cruces that resolved nothing but needed having. Ezra stayed in his corner, which was Ezra's way of communicating solidarity, without requiring anyone to discuss it. Buck had moved to the porch sometime in the middle of the rush, which she had noted and approved of silently. A man who understood when his presence complicated someone else's work was not a thing she had encountered in excess. She was restocking the shelf above the counter when Ginny Stone came in. Ginny did not eat breakfast at the station. She ate at her desk above the druggist's while reading Precedent, which was an efficient system suited to a woman who operated on efficiency the way other people operated on sentiment. When she appeared before noon, she had something to say that she did not want to commit to paper or to the street. She sat at the counter. Clara poured without being asked. Arthur Cole sent correspondence to my office this morning. Ginny's reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead, which meant she had come directly from work. Official bank stationery. Something about irregularities in the original deed documentation. Clara set the coffee pot down with the care of someone making sure the thing they are setting down does not express anything. There are no irregularities. Level. I know that, you know that. Arthur Cole knows that, because he was present for 3 of the signing sessions. Ginny looked at her over the displaced glasses, which means he has been instructed to claim otherwise. Which means Warren Cole is willing to use his brother as an instrument even when the instrument will bear the consequences. She paused. Clara, I have asked you 3 times about those letters. I burned them. The silence that followed had several distinct layers and she could feel each of them. All 4, all 4. Ginny Stone pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed through it in the specific way that very controlled people breathe when they are absorbing information that tests the control. Then she set her hands flat on the counter and looked at Clara with the expression she reserved for situations where the evidence was what it was, and the only remaining question was strategy. From this moment, every piece of correspondence, every interaction, every incident, documented, witnessed where possible, kept. She picked up her coffee. We build the record that you should have started 6 weeks ago. And Clara, this is going to get considerably worse before it resolves. Clara looked through the front window at the porch, where Buck Calloway stood with his back to the door, watching Main Street with the patient attention of a man who had spent years in the practice and had not yet found a reason to stop. She thought about the canyon in '71 and the math that should not have worked and the man who had made it work anyway. She thought about what it meant that Buck had showed up in Rimrock the same week. The letters stopped being polite. "I'm beginning to understand the shape of how much worse," she said. Ginny followed her gaze to the porch, assessed what was there with the brisk efficiency she applied to most things, looked back at Clara, with an expression that asked several questions simultaneously while committing to none of them. New customer. He knew Thomas from before. Clara moved to start the lunch prep. "He's helping with the water barrels Thursday." Ginny drank her coffee. A pause. "He plans to stay long?" "He hasn't said." Ginny said again, in precisely the same tone, but with different punctuation underneath it, and Clara did not pursue that particular thread, because some conversations were most productive when you let them be. She rode to Ginny's office after the lunch service, the thing she had been circling since the morning now requiring approach. She had been thinking about the town council meeting, the last Thursday of every month, 7 days away. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about a thing you have not yet decided to do, but that keeps reappearing in your thinking with increasing frequency until the thinking becomes difficult to ignore. She had burned 4 letters. She had no documentation. She had a well that served most of Rimrock and a man with pressed suits and expensive paper who had decided she would sell and was proceeding through whatever sequence of steps would make that true. What she had that Warren Cole did not have was 60 people who drew water from Thomas's well and who were going to draw it tomorrow and the day after, and if she stood up in front of them and asked who among them understood what Cole's ownership of this property would mean for the price and availability of that water, she would be asking a question that answered itself. Cole's power came from doing things quietly, from letters and banknotes and inspections, and the specific kind of pressure that worked best when the person receiving it felt alone with it. Public light was the one variable his approach could not absorb. She was afraid of standing up in that hall. She knew this clearly. Acknowledging it was not the same as obeying it. Thomas had explained this to her once on this same porch on a summer evening in '74, about 8 months before the last job. He'd been talking about something else entirely, a difficult conversation he'd had with a witness who didn't want to testify, and he'd said that courage was not the feeling of being unafraid. Courage was the feeling of being thoroughly afraid and doing the thing anyway, because the thing was right, and because being afraid of it was simply not a sufficient reason to leave it undone. She had thought about those words approximately 400 times since he died. She thought about them now, sitting on her horse in the March wind outside Ginny's door, and she thought, 7 days. She thought, 60 people and a well and a man with pressed suits who has not yet understood that there is a difference between a woman who has nothing left to lose and a woman who has decided exactly what she will not lose. She went inside and told Ginny she was going to speak at the council meeting. Ginny looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when someone had made a decision she agreed with, and she was deciding whether to say so or simply proceed. She decided to proceed. "All right," she said and opened her notepad. "Let's talk about what you're going to say." Buck was on the porch when she rode back. He turned when he heard her horse and watched her dismount, with the steady attention he gave to things he was paying attention to, which was most things. She tied the horse and came up the steps and stood beside him looking at Main Street in the late afternoon. "The town council meeting is Thursday week," she said. "I'm going to speak." He turned to look at her more directly. Not surprised, she thought, assessing. "Women don't speak at the Rimrock Council," he said. "Not an objection. A statement of the current condition of things. There's no rule against it. It simply hasn't been done." She looked at him. "I'm going to ask how many people in that hall draw water from Thomas's well. And then I'm going to ask them what they think Warren Cole intends to charge for it once he controls the source." Buck was quiet for a moment. The wind came down Main Street with intention, moving the dust in the low spiraling patterns it made when the afternoon temperature dropped faster than the ground wanted to release its heat. "Cole will have people there," he said. "Yes. They'll try to interrupt." "Yes." She looked at him directly, the way she had found herself looking at him over the last 24 hours, with the particular attention she gave to things she was trying to understand accurately. "But if Warren Cole's interference is witnessed by 60 people who just raise their hands about the water, then his interference is no longer a private thing. It becomes a public thing, and public things have a different weight." Buck Calloway was quiet for a moment that had thinking in it, rather than hesitation, which she had already begun to understand was a distinction worth tracking with him. Then he said something that landed with the quiet force of a thing, said by someone who has been carrying it for longer than the conversation. Thomas Calloway reads situations the way you just described that one. Saw the variable that changed the math and moved toward it. She looked at the street, at the shape of rimrock in the late light, the adobe and the wood, and the dust and the particular sky over the mesa, that she had looked at every evening for 7 years, and that still occasionally caught her in a moment when she had not prepared for it to be beautiful. He would have gone to the meeting, she said, in his good shirt and his coat, and he would have said what needed saying, without adjusting it for the people who didn't want to hear it. She paused. I intend to do the same. Buck looked at her with something that had moved past the careful assessment into something she did not have a precise name for yet, but that she set aside to look at more closely later, when the day was finished, and the kitchen was quiet, and there was time to look at things properly. I'll be there, he said, simply. As though it were obvious, she went back inside to start the dinner prep and did not say anything further about it, which felt like the right amount to have said. Outside the window, the late light was doing its slow work on the mesa, and the wind had dropped to the kind that moved rather than pushed, and she could hear Buck's boots on the porch boards. As he moved to the far railing and back, the particular weight and pace of a man who was standing watch, without having been asked to, because the situation called for it, and he had understood that without requiring it to be explained. She made the biscuits for tomorrow, confirmed the flour supply, wrote 2 sentences in the back of the order ledger that she had started using as a record of interactions with Warren Cole, because Ginny was right and she should have started 3 letters earlier, and starting now was what was available. She wrote, March 14, 1879. Cole entered station without announcement approximately 830. Placed 5th envelope on counter. Envelope burned by CR. Cole stated rimrock was changing and implied consequences for those who did not understand this. 2 men accompanied him, Ford and unknown second. She underlined the word 5th. It was a small thing. It was the only piece of documentation she had. It would have to be enough to start with. And starting with enough to start was how Thomas had approached every job he had ever worked. And she had watched him do it enough times that the principle had settled into her, without her having to adopt it deliberately. It was simply how things worked. She closed the ledger and put it back under the counter and set the biscuits for morning, and turned off the lights in the front of the station, and went to the back, where Thomas's coat still hung on its peg, and the ceiling still had its slight northeastern irregularity, and the March wind was doing its patient work outside. She lay down and thought about 60 people in a hall, and 30 of them on their feet, and Warren Cole's smile, dropping 3% of its structural confidence when she put his envelope in the fire. Small things, adding up, the way they always did towards something. She slept before the wind changed. The Monday after the council meeting, the bank sent a letter. Not Cole, not Silas Ford, the bank. First Rimrock Savings and Loan, with its official letterhead and its careful typography, and its language that managed to be both apologetic and absolute in the way that institutional language perfects over years of practice. Clara read it standing at the counter before she had unlocked the front door. Read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read it a 3rd time because the number at the bottom did not change between readings, which she had known it wouldn't, which had not stopped her from hoping. $480. The remaining balance on Thomas's original deed note, called due in full within 45 days, on the grounds of documentation irregularities discovered during a routine portfolio review. 45 days. She had $48 and some coin in the tin box. She put the letter in the drawer under the counter, where she kept the order ledger and the pencils, and a folded copy of Thomas's deed that she had taken to keeping close after the 2nd letter from Cole, and she unlocked the front door, and started the coffee, and began the work of the morning, because the morning required beginning, regardless of what the drawer contained. Ezra McIntosh came in at 6:15 as he always did. He sat in his corner. He looked at her face with the unhurried attention of a man who had spent decades reading terrain and weather and had simply transferred those skills to people, and he said nothing for exactly as long as it took her to pour his coffee and set it in front of him. Bank? His voice was the color of old wood. Bank. She moved back to the counter. Cole's reaching, he wrapped both hands around the cup. Man reaches that many directions at once, he's telling you he's worried. She had thought the same thing in the dark at 3 in the morning, and it had not made her feel better then either. He doesn't look worried. No. He looks very comfortable. Ezra drank. That's different from not being worried. Buck came in from the back at 6:30. He had been sleeping in the back room for 6 days now, and helping with the morning water haul and fixing the hinge on the storage door that had been dragging since February, and they had developed a wordless morning protocol in which he came in and poured his own coffee and sat at the end of the counter away from the customers, and she moved around him the way you move around furniture you have placed deliberately. He could feel when something had shifted. She had noticed this. He looked at her once and then looked at the drawer under the counter and then looked back at his coffee. She told him after the breakfast crowd cleared, pulled the letter out and laid it on the counter between them and let him read it without narration. He read it once, put it down. 45 days. Yes, Ginny Stone, I'm going this morning. He nodded. Drank the last of his coffee. Set the cup down with the careful placement of a man thinking through a problem that he has not yet figured out how to name. While you're at Ginny's, I'll look at the water system in the back. Thomas's pipe fitting on the east junction has been seeping. It was such a practical, grounded, ordinary thing to say that she felt something in her chest loosen in a way that had nothing to do with the pipe fitting. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went to saddle her horse. Ginny Stone's office above the druggist's was exactly the size it needed to be, and no larger, which was very Ginny. Books on 3 walls. A desk that had seen real use. A window that looked out over Main Street and which Ginny stood at when she was thinking and sat away from when she was working. She was sitting when Clara came in, which meant she already knew or suspected, which meant that news in Rimrock moved at the pace of a winter wind looking for gaps. Clara put the letter on the desk. Ginny read it without expression. Set it down. Looked at Clara over the tops of her glasses with the look she reserved for situations that were serious and required her to not make them feel worse by reacting to them as though they were serious. When did you receive this? This morning in the original deed note. Paid in full in 76. I have every receipt. Good. That's very good. Ginny folded her hands. Clara, this is manufactured. Thomas's note was clean. The documentation was thorough. I handled the refinancing myself. She paused. Arthur Cole signed 3 of those documents, I know. Which means Arthur Cole is the person who is now claiming those same documents have irregularities. I know. Ginny looked at the letter again with the expression of someone examining a piece of evidence they find personally offensive. I'm going to draft a response today. I'll demand full written specification of every alleged irregularity, with dates, with the names of the reviewers, with the legal basis for calling a fully paid note. That will slow them down because they cannot produce documentation for irregularities that do not exist. She looked up. It buys time. Not more than 30 days probably. And Clara, it is not a solution. It is a delay. I understand. You need to start thinking about what the solution looks like. Because if Cole gets a compliant judge to validate this, the delay is all we have. Ginny took off her glasses entirely, which she only did when she was about to say something she wanted received without the filter of formality. Is there anyone who could help? Financially, or otherwise? Clara thought about the tin box. Thought about the 30-some people who had stood up in the council hall 4 days ago. Thought about Buck Calloway at her kitchen counter, reading the bank letter, with his jaw doing the thing it did when he was holding his reaction inside himself, rather than letting it out where it could cause complications. I'm working on otherwise, she said. She rode back to the station in the thin March wind and tied her horse and went in through the side door. Buck was at the pipe junction in the backyard with his coat off, despite the temperature, which meant the seep had been worse than he had let on, and the work had gotten into it. He had the fitting disassembled and laid out on a piece of canvas with the organization of a man who had taken apart enough things to know that reassembly went better when you could see all the pieces at once. She stood in the doorway and looked at him working. His hands were careful and methodical on the iron fittings, turning each piece to inspect it before setting it back on the canvas. He had not heard her come out, or had heard her, and chosen not to mark it, which with him she was beginning to understand could be either. The junction was cracked through, he said without looking up. Not just seeping, If it had gone another few weeks, it would have been a proper break. She came out onto the back step. The yard was small and practical. The well housing to the left, the repaired storage shed to the right with its new wall section still showing lighter wood than the old. You can fix it. Already have. He held up the new coupling she had not seen him produce. Found this in the back of your tool shelf. Thomas was apparently the kind of man who kept spare fittings. He kept spare everything. She sat down on the step. The wind had dropped slightly, and the sun was doing what little it could at that hour. He said the only thing worse than needing a thing was needing it and not having it. Buck set the coupling down and looked at it. Good principle. She told him about Ginny's assessment. All of it, including the part about the 30 days of delay, and what came after the 30 days if nothing changed. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished he picked up the coupling and began fitting it to the junction housing with the steady attention he gave to physical problems. Arthur Cole, he said. Not a question. He signed the original documents. He's now the one claiming the documents have problems. He knows there are no problems, yes, which means Warren told him to do it. The coupling threaded smoothly, and he began tightening it by hand, which means Warren is willing to expose his own brother to legal consequences to put pressure on you. He stopped tightening, looked at the fitting rather than at her. That tells you something about how much he wants this property. It tells me something about how much he wants it, and how little he worries about what happens to people around him while he's getting it. She watched a hawk moving in slow circles above the mesa to the north. I think Arthur Cole is more afraid of his brother than he is of the law. I think if that balance shifted, he might make a different calculation. Buck was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the wrench. You're thinking about going to see him. I'm thinking about it. Alone. I don't need an escort to talk to a man at a bank. She paused. I need the right argument. He tightened the coupling with 3 deliberate turns and put the wrench down, and looked at her for the first time since she had come out. The bruise around his eye had moved from the purple-black of the first days into the yellowing that came before it disappeared entirely. And his face, without the dramatic coloring, was simply his face, which was neither hard nor soft, but carried the quality of something that had been through weather and found out what it was made of. The right argument, he said, is that he's on the wrong side of a line that's about to be crossed, and crossed lines have paperwork, and paperwork has names on it. She thought about that. You've done this before. Turned witnesses. He picked up the canvas and the tools. It's mostly arithmetic. You make the cost of continuing to lie higher than the cost of stopping. Most people aren't committed to anything deeply enough to absorb real cost, and the ones who are, they're the ones you don't try to turn. He carried the tools toward the back door. You just make sure they're looking at you when the line gets crossed, so there's no question who was standing where. She went to see Arthur Cole the next morning. While Buck fixed the hinge on the front gate that had been loose since she could remember, she rode rather than walked, because riding meant she arrived with intention visible from a distance, which was a thing Thomas had told her about first impressions, and which she had applied to enough situations to have confirmed as reliable. The bank was the most substantial building on the east side of Main Street, brick-faced with 2 glass windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back at you in a way that felt faintly aggressive. Clara tied her horse at the rail and went inside and did not look at the teller who started to rise from his stool when she came in. She went directly to the door at the back that said Arthur Cole, manager, and knocked once and opened it without waiting. Arthur Cole was younger than his brother by perhaps a decade, and smaller in every dimension, which was not a difficult achievement given Warren's scale, but still produced a man who seemed somehow concentrated rather simply compact. He had their father's jaw, apparently, from the family portrait behind his desk, and his brother's eyes, which was as the least fortunate inheritance available. He was seated when she came in. He did not stand, which she noted, and she sat down across from him, without being invited, which she noted she was doing. She laid Thomas's receipts on his desk. Everyone. 7 years of quarterly payments, each signed and countersigned, the final settlement receipt at the top. Arthur Cole's own signature visible on 4 of them in the blue ink he apparently favored. I'm not here to discuss the bank's letter, she said. I'm here to show you that you signed these. You know what they say. You know what the deed note said when it was settled, and you know that anything you put in writing now that contradicts these, will have your name on it next to the contradiction. She let that sit for a moment. When the federal examiner comes, and Ginny Stone is very good at accelerating that kind of visit, the first question they ask is not what happened. It's who signed what and when. Your brother's name is on his correspondence. Your name is on the bank's documentation. She folded her hands in her lap. He makes the decisions. You sign the papers. That is not a position with a great deal of protection in it. Mr. Cole? Arthur Cole looked at the receipts. His hands on his desk were very still. He was a man, she thought, who had spent considerable energy arranging his life, so that the most frightening thing in it was not the federal government. He had not arranged it quite carefully enough. Mrs. Reed, his voice was lower than she expected. Careful. You are not wrong about the mathematics of this situation, but you are perhaps not fully accounting for the other side of those mathematics. Your brother. He said nothing, which was its own complete answer. She stood, left the receipts on his desk because she had copies. She was at the door when she paused, because she wanted to say the next thing facing away from him rather than at him, which was a choice Thomas had told her he sometimes made in difficult conversations to give the other person room to receive it without having to manage their expression at the same time. Thomas used to say that the people who stand still while wrong things happen end up in the same place as the people who do them. Just more slowly. She opened the door. Think about what side of that line you want to be on before the line moves. She rode back to the station and did not know yet whether it had worked. She thought it had reached something. She thought Arthur Cole was a man who had told himself many times that what he was doing was just banking and that the decisions were his brother's, and that a signature was just a signature. She thought she had made that particular story a little harder to tell himself. Whether harder was sufficient was a question only time, and the pressure his brother was willing to apply, could answer. That evening she was doing the last of the kitchen cleanup when she heard Buck's voice from the porch, low and addressed to someone who was not inside. She dried her hands and went to the front window before going outside, which was also something Thomas had taught her, and which she had never had occasion to resent. A man she did not know sat on the porch step below Buck, mid-40s. Red-brown hair going gray at the temples. The look of someone who had ridden a considerable distance without particularly minding the ride. He had the posture that a certain kind of man carried from a certain kind of work, and it matched Buck's posture in the way that two things match when they come from the same place. She went out. Buck turned toward her, and something in the way he turned told her this conversation was already complicated before she arrived. Clara Reed, Jed Warren. Jed rode with me for 6 years with the Rangers. Jed Warren stood, took his hat off. Mrs. Reed. I apologize for the hour. He did not look sorry for the hour. He looked like a man working through something with efficiency, because efficiency was how he managed things that were difficult. I need to speak with Buck. I rode out from Abilene. He glanced at Buck. There's something you need to see. She looked at Buck. He was looking at Jed with an expression she had not yet seen on him, which was not saying nothing since he had a narrow range of visible expression to begin with. This was different. This was the expression of a man who has been waiting for a thing and has just been told it has arrived, and he is not certain whether to be relieved or to be afraid of what he is about to feel. Go inside, she said. I'll make coffee. She made coffee and brought it to the back room and left it, and went back to the kitchen, because they were not including her yet, and she was not going to make herself included by hovering at the edge of something she had not been invited into. She cleaned what was already clean. She could hear their voices through the wall, low and occasionally stopping entirely, which was the rhythm of a conversation involving documents or maps rather than simply memory. She did not hear the specific words. She did not need to. She heard at one point Buck's voice stop in a way that was not a pause for breath or a pause for thought. It was the stop of someone who has just been shown a thing they had suspected and had believed and had never quite been certain of, until this moment of certainty, and the certainty was not a relief, because it was the kind that closes a door that had been standing open for a very long time. Would you treat them with kindness? She went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and thought about Thomas and thought about the specific quality of not knowing something for certain that you believe to be true and how you carry that differently from the confirmed version, and how the confirmation, when it comes, rearranges the weight without removing it. Jed Warren left before 9. She heard the front door and then the sound of a horse and then quiet. Buck came into the kitchen. He stood for a moment at the edge of the room in the lamplight, with his hands at his sides, and his face doing the internal work that it did when he was deciding how much of a thing to give words to. She poured him coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from where he would sit if he sat, and waited. He sat. He put both hands around the cup. He looked at it. Warren Cole, he said. His real name is Walter Crane. She kept her face still. She was good at this and had learned it the hard way. In '74, I was running down a job in Abilene, running it for 3 months. Getting close. He stopped, moved the cup a quarter-inch to the left, moved it back. Someone didn't want me to finish it. The way they expressed that was to find where I lived and make sure I came home to something that couldn't be undone. His voice was steady in the way that water is steady when it is moving over a very hard surface rather than when it is still. It wasn't Walter Crane personally who did it. He paid someone to do it and stayed far enough back that there was no direct line. By the time I had worked through to where the line started, he had a different name and was in a different territory, and had enough new legitimate business between him and the old business that the law couldn't make the case hold. Clara's hands were flat on the table. She did not move them. Your wife, Margaret, just the name. It was enough. She had nothing to do with any of it. She was just the most efficient way to stop me. The lamp on the shelf behind him threw his shadow long across the floor. Outside, the wind was doing its night work on the corners of the building, and somewhere down the street a door closed, and nothing else moved in Rimrock at this hour. Jed has been following the paper trail for 2 years, Buck said. Walter Crane became Warren Cole somewhere in Oklahoma in '76, moved to New Mexico in '77, started buying property through legal channels with money that originated in anything but legal channels. He looked up from the cup. The trail is solid enough to interest a federal judge, not yet solid enough to guarantee a conviction, not without something more recent, something that can be shown to be part of a pattern. She understood before he finished saying it. What he's doing to me, harassment, manufactured legal pressure, bank interference, threatening correspondence. He said it without inflection, cataloging, if it can be documented. And if the Cole in these documents can be connected to the Crane in Jed's documents, then we have a pattern that a federal prosecutor can work with. She thought about the 4 letters she had burned. She thought about this with a feeling she could not precisely name, which contained anger and something that was not quite regret, because regret required a different kind of not knowing. I burned the letters, I know. That was before I understood what they were. I know. He looked at her steadily. You've kept everything since. Ginny has the bank correspondence. There have been other incidents. He paused. The man who turned your horse out of the stable last week. She had told him about that. The horse found 3 miles out, unharmed. The stable latch not forced but opened, which meant someone who knew how latches worked, rather than someone in a hurry. I didn't see who did it. No. But I found the boot prints. Consistent with Silas Ford's build and stride. Consistent doesn't prove, but consistent added to consistent eventually produces a picture. He picked up the coffee finally, drank, set it down. Clara, I have to tell you something that I told myself I would not tell you because I wasn't certain. And now I am certain, and keeping it from you doesn't serve either of us. She waited. I didn't come to Rimrock entirely because of Thomas. That was real. The debt was real. But Jed had connected Cole's current activity to Crane's name 3 weeks before I arrived. I came because Thomas's connection to this property created a reason to be here that was less complicated to explain than the truth. He looked at his hands. I was looking for Walter Crane. I was not certain he was here until I looked into Warren Cole's eyes that first morning and saw the kind of careful I remembered from the trial documentation. The lamp gave a small breath of light variation and steadied. She thought about this for the length of time it took to think about it honestly. It was not a simple thing. He had come with a reason he had not disclosed, and had found a situation that produced more reasons and had and whether that sequence constituted a betrayal depended on what you believed a person owed you before you had given them reason to owe you anything. Thomas had told her once that the most honest people he knew were not the people who told you everything. They were the people who told you true things and did not invent false ones to fill the spaces. Is there anything else you haven't told me? She meant it as a genuine question, not a trap. He thought about it, which was, she understood, his version of respect. He did not give fast answers to real questions. No. Then we're current. She stood and picked up her cup. Jed's documents and my documents need to be in the same room with Ginny Stone as soon as possible. She looked at him. That means tomorrow morning. He nodded. Something in his face did a thing she had not seen it do before, which was a small and involuntary loosening of some tension that had been there long enough that she had taken it for his natural expression. It was not his natural expression, it was what he had been carrying on top of it. "I'm going to say something," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I came here for Thomas and for Crane. Those were the two things I knew." He looked at her directly, which he always did, but which meant something different this time, because of what was underneath the looking. "There's a third thing now that I didn't account for, and I don't know what to do with it yet. So I'm not going to do anything with it yet, but I wanted you to know that I know it's there." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the careful distance she had kept since the first morning. The protocol. The wordless morning arithmetic of two people sharing a space without crowding it. She thought about the particular loneliness of 4 years of mornings in this kitchen, and how she had made her peace with it, the way you make peace with a persistent weather condition. "When you figure out what to do with it," she said, "you'll know where to find me." She went to bed. She did not sleep for a while. This was different from the usual not sleeping, which was about numbers and letters and the weight of what the tin box didn't contain. This not sleeping had a different quality to it. Lighter, somehow, more air in it. The next morning she left Buck at the station and rode to Ginny's office before the town had properly woken and came in to find Ginny already at her desk with coffee, which meant Jed Warren had gone there directly after leaving Reed's station, which meant Ginny had been awake for some time, which meant Ginny Stone's opinion of the situation's urgency matched her own. She sat down. Ginny pushed a cup across the desk. "Jed Warren's documents are solid. 2 years of work. Your recent documentation, what we have since you started keeping things, fills in exactly the gap that his trail leaves." Ginny's reading glasses were on this time, which meant they were in working mode. "If we can get this to Judge Alderman in Santa Fe by the end of the week, there is a reasonable case for a federal investigation, not a conviction. An investigation, which is the thing that opens every subsequent door. How do we get it there by the end of the week?" Ginny looked at her over the glasses. "Someone has to ride." The answer was obvious, and they both knew it. Buck knew Judge Alderman from his Rangers years. Buck had the documents that connected Walter Crane to Warren Cole. Buck's testimony, if it came to testimony, was the center of what Jed had spent 2 years building. How long? 4 days there, 4 back if he pushes. Ginny was already making notes. "I'll have everything organized and packaged today. He can leave tomorrow at dawn." Clara thought about the bank's 45-day window, about Arthur Cole in his office behind his banker's door with his hands very still on his desk, about Silas Ford's boot prints in the dirt near the stable, about Warren Cole and the smile that arrived slightly before and left slightly after everything else on his face. She thought about Buck riding toward Santa Fe with the documents that could end this. She thought about Reed's station in the nights that he was gone. She thought about Jed Warren, who was good and competent and had 2 good eyes, and none of the particular history that made Buck Calloway specifically useful to have on the same property as Silas Ford. She thought, this is what it looks like to fight something the right way. You send the person who can do the thing that matters most to where it needs to be done, and you hold the ground at home, and you do not confuse the discomfort of the arrangement with the wrongness of it. She rode back to the station and told Buck to be ready to leave at dawn. She told him what Jean had said about the judge and the timeline and the structure of what they were trying to build. He listened with his cup in his hand and his face doing its careful work, and when she finished, he set the cup down. "You'll be here alone. Not an objection. An inventory. Jed Warren is staying." She met his eyes. "And I'm not alone in this town. I proved that on Thursday." She paused. "I proved it to myself more than anyone else, but it counts." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the station, a horse passed at a trot, and then the street was quiet again, and the morning light lay flat and clear across the plank floor between them. "I'll be back in 8 days." The way he said it was not a promise exactly. It was closer to a statement of intention, which from him she was learning was the more serious of the two. She nodded once. "Don't push the horse past what he can give. You'll need him sound when you get there." He almost smiled. It was close enough that she counted it. That night she lay awake again. But this time she was thinking about Ginny's organizational instincts and Arthur Cole's very still hands and the specific arithmetic of 45 days against 8, and what could be built in the space between them. She was thinking clearly. She was thinking in the direction of forward, which was different from the last several weeks of thinking, which had been mostly the circular variety. She was still awake when she heard Buck's voice from somewhere outside, low and talking to the horse he would take tomorrow, the way some men talked to horses when they thought no one was listening, which was usually the most honest speaking they did all day. She could not make out the words. She did not need to. She could hear the tone of it, which was a man telling a horse what they were going to do and why it mattered, and underneath the tone was the other thing, the one he had said he didn't know what to do with yet, speaking in its own register below the words. She turned on her side and looked at the window where the early stars were doing their patient work above the mesa. Thomas's coat on the peg was a silhouette she knew by heart. She had spent 4 years talking to it in her head, the way she imagined he would have talked to the horse, the way people talk to the gone ones when they need to say a thing out loud, and there is only one person they ever trusted with the unguarded version. She said, "I think he's a good man, Thomas. I think he came here for the right reasons even if he didn't tell me all of them at once." She said, "I'm not replacing anything. I know that's not how it works." She said, "I'm just telling you because you'd want to know, and because this room still feels like you're in it sometimes, and because I have not yet found the occasion to move your coat, and I'm not sure I ever will, and I think that's all right." She closed her eyes. Outside, Buck's voice had stopped, and the night was just the night and the wind and the particular silence of Rimrock at the far edge of evening. She slept. Buck left before the sky had decided what color it was going to be. Clara heard the horse at 4:30 and did not go to the window because she had already said what there was to say the night before, and adding to it in the dark would not improve it. She lay still and listened to the sound of a man preparing to ride a long distance with purpose, which has a particular rhythm to it, unhurried but without waste, and then the sound of hooves moving away from the station and diminishing down the empty street until there was only the wind and the particular quality of silence that follows the departure of someone whose presence you had not fully measured until it was absent. She was up at 5, coffee on, biscuits started, the morning work as it always was, which was the most reliable thing she owned for managing the kind of thinking that produced nothing useful. Jed Warren came in at 6, earlier than she had expected. He sat at the counter where Buck had been and accepted coffee without being asked, and did not say anything he did not need to say, which she had come to understand was simply how Jed Warren operated in situations that required attention rather than performance. He'll make Santa Fe in 4 days if the weather holds. He was looking at the window and the pale early light that had not yet committed to anything. Judge Alderman is a careful man. He'll want a day with the documents before he moves. Then 8 days total, more or less. Jed wrapped both hands around the cup. Longer if Cole moves before Buck gets back. Shorter if Alderman decides he's been waiting long enough. He looked at her. Jed sent his own telegram to Alderman's office the night he arrived in Rimrock. 2 years of correspondence between them about the Crane case. The judge already knows the shape of what Buck is bringing. What Buck carries fills in the gap that Jed couldn't close from Abilene. Alderman will move on the day Buck arrives because he has been positioned to move for 6 months and has simply been waiting for the current documentation. She absorbed this. It meant the timeline was tighter than she had calculated and also more certain. 8 days or fewer, which meant Cole had the same window and knew it, or would know it when his own people told him what was happening in Santa Fe. "What do you think he'll do?" she said. Jed considered this the way he considered everything, which was with the deliberateness of a man who had learned that the first answer to a tactical question was usually the obvious one, and the obvious one was usually correct. He knows the bank letter isn't closing this. He knows the legal route has slowed. He'll go direct. Not against you personally, against the property. Something that changes what this place is worth before the document can matter. She thought about Silas Ford's boot prints in the dirt near the stable. The professional patience of a man who understood that the most useful pressure was the kind that left no clear line back to its source. The well housing. Most likely, if the water supply is interrupted, even temporarily, you lose the argument you made to 60 people in that council hall. The property's value changes overnight and Cole's offer looks different in the morning than it did the night before. She had been thinking about this since the meeting. Had catalogued the vulnerabilities of Reed's station the way Thomas had taught her to catalogue a situation before a difficult job, not to generate fear but to generate preparation. The well housing was sound. The pipe junction Buck had repaired was holding. The source itself was deep and hard to reach, but the access points were not. "I'll need help watching it at night," she said. This was not difficult to say, because asking for what you need is different from admitting you cannot manage without it. And she had been clear about the distinction for some years now. "I'll take midnight to 4, Jed said, with the flatness of a man for whom night watches were simply a category of work like any other. "You take the evening. I'll relieve you." She nodded. "There's a cot in the tool room off the backyard." They had arranged the next week in approximately 90 seconds, which was one of the genuine advantages of talking to people who had no interest in the performance of conversation. The days without Buck had a different texture than the days before he had arrived, which told her something she did not particularly need confirmed but noted anyway. She noticed it without dwelling on it, which was the most useful relationship she had found with things that could not be changed by noticing them. The mornings were full. Breakfast, clean-up, supply, the ongoing work of keeping Ginny Stone informed of anything that shifted, and the maintenance of Reed Station's normal operations, because the one thing she would not allow Warren Cole to accomplish through sustained pressure was the closing of her doors. People came for breakfast, and they came for lunch, and some of them, the ones who had been in the council hall and had raised their hands and watched 34 of their neighbors stand up, came with a quality of deliberate purpose that she understood was not purely about the food. They were making a statement with their presence, and they knew it, and she knew it, and neither party mentioned it directly, which made the statement more rather than less. Ezra McIntosh came every morning as always and departed every morning as always, and behaved with such complete normality that she had come to understand it was his specific form of reassurance. When Ezra McIntosh behaved normally, things had not yet crossed the threshold that would cause Ezra McIntosh to behave otherwise. The third day after Buck left, Arthur Cole came to the station at 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch crowd had cleared, and she was alone in the kitchen with flour on her hands and the quiet that settled between services. He was alone. No Ford, no Warren. Just Arthur Cole with his hat held in both hands and the expression of a man who has made a decision at considerable personal cost and has not yet adjusted to the weight of having made it. She waited without speaking. "My brother is moving up his timeline." He said it to the middle distance rather than to her, which was its own form of courage for a man who had perfected indirect communication over many years. "He has a meeting with a land investor from Denver. It was scheduled for next month. He has moved it to next week." He stopped. His hands worked at the hat brim without his appearing to notice, which means he needs this situation resolved before then. She stayed very still. What does resolved mean in his calendar? Arthur Cole looked at her then directly, and in his face was the expression of a man who has spent a month telling himself that a signature is only a signature, and has run completely out of the capacity for that particular story. It means he's going to do something that cannot be walked back. Something that changes what this property represents before the documents you have can matter. He swallowed. "He told me last night. He didn't give me specifics, because he's been careful with specifics since you came to my office. But I know his options. The well." He said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. "When?" "Before the end of the week." He didn't say which night. The hat brim continued its slow rotation between his hands. "Mrs. Reed, I want you to understand that what I am doing right now is not comfortable for me. I know. I want you to understand that I know what it will cost. I know that too." She came closer to the counter. "Mr. Cole, what you're doing right now is the only thing that separates your situation from your brother's. That's not a threat, that's arithmetic, and you understand arithmetic." He nodded once, turned to leave, stopped with his back to her, and she recognized the posture from something Thomas had told her about difficult conversations. How sometimes you gave a person the facing away, so they had room to receive a thing without having to manage their expression at the same time. "My brother's name before he came to New Mexico was not Cole," he said, to the door. "I thought perhaps you already knew, but in case you didn't." He put his hat on. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Reed." The door closed. She stood with the flour drying on her hands and the afternoon light lying still across the counter. Then she went to the backyard and found Jed Warren repairing the fence along the east property line and told him everything Arthur Cole had said, in the order he had said it, including the last part. Jed set down his tool, looked at the well housing, the gate, the alley where Ford's boot prints had been in the dirt. Tonight or tomorrow night, he said. He won't wait for the weekend. More movement then. What do we need? More people than we have. He picked up the tool. Me and you and the shotgun handles property damage. It doesn't handle something larger. We need people who have already decided which side they're on, and don't need the question put to them fresh at midnight. She thought about 60 people in a hall and 34 of them on their feet. She thought about what it meant that they had been showing up for breakfast every day since, sitting in their usual places, drinking their usual coffee, making themselves visible at a table that Warren Cole wanted to empty. She thought about Ezra McIntosh, who had been a soldier once, and who still moved like a man who remembered what it meant to hold ground when the ground mattered. I need to talk to some people, she said. She went to Ezra first. He was on his porch in the afternoon sun with coffee, and the expression of a man who was available to think about something specific, if something specific required thinking about, she told him. He listened without interrupting and drank his coffee, and when she finished, he looked at the mesa to the north for a moment. With the unhurried attention of a man who has assessed difficult terrain before and knows the value of looking at it completely before deciding. Tonight or tomorrow, he said. Most likely. I'll send word to Morrison and the Burkett boys. Between from 5 of us we can cover the back, the alley, and the east side of the yard. He paused. Ford is smart enough to know when he's walked into a room that was ready for him. That matters more than numbers. He stood up, which for a man of 72 with the accumulated history in his joints, was a statement in itself. Are you sleeping in the station tonight? Yes. Good. It's your ground, Clara. Stand on it. By 10 o'clock that night she could see from the kitchen window that the shadows at the edge of the backyard had the quality that occupied shadows have, which is different from empty ones, in a way that is difficult to describe precisely and immediately apparent to anyone who has spent time in situations where the difference matters. She sat down with the shotgun across her knees, and the lamp turned low, and the particular kind of quiet that comes when you have done everything you can do, and the next thing is waiting for what arrives. He came at 1 in the morning. Not Ford. Cole himself, which neither she nor Jed had expected, and which Jed communicated by appearing silently at the kitchen window with an expression that said the calculation had just changed in ways that were immediate and significant. Warren Cole was a man who managed pressure from a distance. He did not involve himself in the operational details of what he set in motion. The fact that he was here himself, in her backyard at 1 in the morning, meant one of two things. Either the situation had escalated past what he trusted anyone else to handle, or his timeline had compressed further than even Arthur had known. She understood before she finished the thought. The Denver investor. Arthur had said next week, but Arthur had not known that Cole had moved the meeting again, moved it to tomorrow morning, and Cole needed this resolved tonight, because tomorrow there would be a man with money standing in his office, expecting to see a property that was cleanly available, and a situation that was cleanly resolved, and Cole could not deliver either with the whole town of Rimrock, having formed opinions about what was happening to Reed Station. She heard his voice in the yard, low, addressed to men who were not Ford, which meant he had brought people, which confirmed that Jed's assessment of what 2 people with a shotgun could manage was accurate, and also confirmed that the 6 occupied shadows around the perimeter of her yard were exactly what the situation required. She went to the back door and opened it. The yard was full of the specific chaos that happens when a plan meets a reality it did not account for. Cole had come with 3 men and walked into 6, who had chosen their positions before anyone arrived, which in any tactical situation is the variable that matters most. Ezra McIntosh stood between Cole and the well housing with his army pistol in his hand, and the expression of a man who had stood in considerably more hostile places than a backyard in New Mexico territory, and had not been moved by any of them. Cole saw her in the doorway, and she saw him properly, for the first time without the layers he always wore, when he came through her front door in daylight, without the pressed suit and the controlled smile and the careful language. Just a man standing in the dark who had come to destroy something that was not his, and had found that the thing was defended. Mrs. Reed. His voice was working harder than usual. The pleasantness was still there, but it was performing visible effort. The way structural things perform visible effort when the structure they are supporting has changed. This doesn't need to be, it already is. She came down the step onto the yard. Mr. Cole, whatever you came here to do tonight has been witnessed by 6 people who will testify to it in any court in New Mexico territory. Your 3 men are outnumbered by people who chose to be here. Silas Ford is not present. She looked at him directly in the dark with the lantern light from the kitchen making long shadows across the ground between them. And Ginny Stone is going to receive a considerable amount of additional material in the morning. He went very still. She had learned that this was his tell, the only one he had, that he went still when he was recalculating, when the variables had shifted and he needed to run the arithmetic again. You can't prove anything. Flat. The pleasantness finally gone because there was no longer any audience for it that it could work on. I don't need to prove everything. She held his gaze. I need to prove enough. And the man who walked out of my counter at 2 this afternoon gave me considerably more than enough. Something moved through Warren Cole's face that was not the recalculation, and was not the stillness. It was something older and more final than either of them. Something that lives in people who have been building a particular structure for a long time, and have just heard the specific sound of a foundation giving way beneath it. Arthur, just the name. Quiet, with a quality that would have made her step back if she had not been standing on her own ground, which she was, which was the entire point of standing where she stood. Your brother made a decision, she said. It's not too late for you to make one too. He stood in her yard for a moment that had weight in it. His 3 men were watching him. Ezra McIntosh was watching him with the army pistol still in his hand, and the patience of a man who had waited out longer silences than this. Jed Warren was watching from the gate, and Clara Reed was watching from the back step of a building that had been standing since 1872, and that contained in its walls and floors and lamp-warmed kitchen the accumulated weight of everything she had built and everything she had lost, and everything she had decided she was not going to surrender to a man with expensive paper and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Cole turned and walked to the gate. His men followed. Jed stepped aside to let them pass, and the gate closed, and the yard was quiet in the particular way that follows when something that was going to happen has been prevented from happening. Ezra lowered his pistol, looked at Clara. That's a man who's going to run, he said. Give him until morning. He won't go before the Denver meeting because he still thinks he can salvage something, but after the meeting fails, he'll go. She did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen until dawn and then went to Ginny Stone's office and knocked until Ginny opened the door in her robe, with the expression of a woman who had been awake herself and had expected the knock. Clara told her everything in the order it had happened. Ginny wrote it all down in her precise hand without interrupting, and when Clara finished, Ginny looked at the pages, and then at Clara with the expression she used when the evidence was complete, and the only remaining question was timing. We need Buck back, Ginny said. With what the judge has and what we have now, there is more than enough for a federal investigation. But the investigation needs to be initiated before Cole disappears. If he runs, it takes years. She looked out her window at Main Street beginning its morning. How certain are you that he won't run before the Denver meeting? Certain enough. Clara said this in the way you say things you have built from sustained observation rather than hope. He's been working toward that deal for 2 years. He won't walk away from it without trying one more time. He'll be in Rimrock tomorrow morning. Then we have today. Ginny was already at her desk. I'm writing to Alderman this morning. Express rider. Jed's telegram will have prepared the ground. What I send confirms the current situation is active and moving. Alderman will be ready to sign the moment Buck arrives. She looked up. Go back to the station. Keep the doors open. Act like it's an ordinary morning. The ordinary morning was the hardest sustained performance she had given in recent memory. She made the coffee and started the biscuits and unlocked the front door and served breakfast and signed the Burkett brothers' petition about the North Road a second time and had the conversation about spring flower with Mrs. Morrison that resolved nothing but needed having. And she poured coffee and cleared plates and kept her face the way Thomas had called her face when she was using it professionally, which was steady and open and entirely uninformative about what was happening on the other side of it. Ezra came in at 6:15. He looked at her once and ordered his coffee and opened his paper and said nothing. Because Ezra McIntosh communicated in the currency of presence, and his presence this morning was its own complete and sufficient statement. Warren Cole did not come. The Denver investor arrived on the afternoon stage. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. A man in city clothes with city luggage, stepping down onto Main Street with the alert, assessing look of someone who has come a long way to see a specific thing and intends to see it. He went directly to Cole's office building on the east side of Main. She watched him go and went back to the prep work, because the prep work needed doing, and because there was nothing to be done about the afternoon stage or the man who had gotten off it. That evening she sat on the back step and looked at the well housing, and the repaired storage shed, and the fence Jed had fixed along the east property line, and thought about Thomas digging the original well in the summer of 1869 with nobody watching because there was nobody yet to watch. Just open ground and the particular quality of hard work that Thomas had brought to everything he decided was worth doing. She thought about him coming in covered in dirt and drinking 3 cups of water from the first bucket the new well produced, and saying that was the best water he had ever tasted, which she had known even then was not about the water. She went to bed at 10 and lay awake looking at the ceiling, with its slight northeastern irregularity, and listening to Jed Warren move through the backyard on his midnight watch, and thought about nothing in particular for a long time, which was its own form of preparation, and eventually slept. She woke at 4 with the specific alertness that comes when something that has been building reaches the morning of the day it resolves. She did not know what form the resolution would take, but she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has been paying close attention for long enough, that it was going to be today. She dressed and went to the kitchen and started the coffee and stood at the window looking at Main Street in the pre-dawn dark and waited for the morning to arrive. She was right about the day. Warren Cole came to Reed Station at 10 in the morning with Silas Ford and a man she did not know and the Denver investor, whose name she would later learn was Harlan Masters. Masters had the look of a man who had been told a story and had come to see the evidence of it and had not yet been informed that the story had a version he had not heard. Cole walked to the counter with the smile fully operational, and the suit pressed and the surface maintained with the skill of a man who had been maintaining surfaces for a very long time. Mrs. Reed. Mr. Masters has expressed interest in the Rimrock water supply, and I thought it useful for him to see the property. I hope you don't mind. She looked at Cole, at Masters, at Silas Ford standing at the door with his hat pulled low and his hands at his sides. She looked at the room around her, at the breakfast crowd that had not entirely cleared, at Ezra McIntosh in his corner booth, at the 3 Burkett cousins who had taken to eating together at Reed Station every day since the council meeting, and who were there now, at Mrs. Morrison at the window table where she did not usually sit, not organized, not planned, just present, the way a community is present around something it has decided matters. The property isn't for sale. She said it at the volume of a normal conversation which carried in the acoustics of Reed Station to every person in the room. It hasn't been for sale. The documentation claiming it's under legal dispute is manufactured, which the federal examination currently underway in Santa Fe will confirm within the week. Harlan Masters looked at Warren Cole. Something moved in his face that was the investor's equivalent of closing a ledger and reaching for his coat. Cole's smile held. It held the way things hold when the structure supporting them has been compromised and is holding on momentum rather than integrity. Mrs. Reed, I don't think this is the appropriate place. This is exactly the place. She kept her voice level. This is my place, Mr. Cole. Or Walter Crane if you prefer the name you were using in Kansas in '74. Before you decided New Mexico offered more suitable conditions for the kind of business you conduct. The room went absolutely silent. Harlan Masters took one deliberate step backward from Warren Cole, which in the language of men who move money was a complete and unambiguous sentence. Cole's face did something she had been waiting to see, not the recalculation, not the stillness, something that lived beneath both of those. Something that surfaces in a person when the last viable door closes and the closing registers in the body before the mind has finished processing it. His eyes moved to Silas Ford at the door, and Ford's hands began to move toward his coat, and that was when Buck Calloway came through the front door of Reed's Station. 8 days. He had said 8 days. It had been 6.5, which she would not fully understand until later, when he told her about riding through 2 nights, and what that had cost the horse, and she would spend the next several weeks watching him make good on his apology to the animal in the particular private way he had. But at 10:15 on a Wednesday morning in March of 1879, he came through the door and occupied the frame the way he occupied frames, and Silas Ford looked at him and completed his own arithmetic and let his hands drop back to his sides. Behind Cole, visible through the front window, 3 riders had pulled up on Main Street in the dust of a long road and sat their horses with the stillness of men who had arrived at a destination and were not in a hurry now that they had arrived. Alderman's advance men, sent ahead to ensure the ground was prepared. Cole saw them when he turned toward the window, which was why he did not move toward the door when he might have. The arithmetic had changed, and he understood that it had changed, and the understanding was visible in him in a way that all his years of careful surface could not conceal. Buck set a folded document on the counter between Clara and Cole. He looked at Clara first, not at Cole, not at the room, not at Masters, at Clara. Judge Alderman's order, federal investigation, authorized yesterday afternoon, effective immediately. Then he looked at Cole, not with anger but with the settled finality of a man who has been carrying a particular weight for a very long time, and has just set it down in the right place at the right moment. Walter Crane, you're going to want to talk to a lawyer. Warren Cole, who had been Warren Cole for 3 years and Walter Crane for 6 years before that, and Harold Vassar for the 40-odd years before that, looked at the document on the counter, and looked at the riders visible through the window, and looked at the room full of Rimrock citizens who were all looking back at him, and did something she had not predicted. He sat down at the nearest table, not running, not arguing, just sitting down in the way that men sit when the weight of what they have been carrying finally and completely exceeds the capacity to carry it while standing. Silas Ford walked out the front door. She heard his horse leave and did not follow the sound. His name was in the documents Buck had brought, and his name was in the documents Jed had spent 2 years assembling, and the combination would follow him wherever he went, and he understood that as well as anyone in the room did. Jed Warren came in through the back, which meant he had been positioned there, which meant Buck had come prepared for the geometry of it, the way Buck prepared for the geometry of things. Jed looked at Cole sitting at the table and at Clara behind the counter, and nodded once to himself with the expression of a man who has been working toward a specific outcome for a specific number of years and is looking at the outcome. Harlan Masters moved toward the door without speaking to anyone. At the threshold he paused and looked back, not at Cole but at the station itself, at the counter and the photographs above the stove and the well housing visible through the side window, with the expression of a man who has just separated a bad partner from a sound opportunity and is already doing the mathematics of the separation. He put his hat on and walked out into the March morning. Ezra McIntosh, who had not moved from his corner, finished his coffee and set down the cup and said, to no one specifically and to everyone present, I've been coming here for 7 years. This is still the best coffee in New Mexico territory. He picked up his paper, turned a page, carry on. The U.S. Marshal arrived 3 days later, and what followed the arrest? Arthur's full cooperation. Sheriff Dobbs riding west before the warrant reached him. Ginny's 11 days of paperwork that she said was among the more satisfying work of her 30 years of practice. Cost Warrant Cole everything he had spent 6 years in New Mexico building and considerably more that he had spent the years before that accumulating. The evening after the marshal left with his prisoner, Clara closed the station at the usual hour and washed the counter and turned the lamps low and sat down at the kitchen table with cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. Buck sat across from her. Neither of them was pretending that the conversation was about anything other than what it was about. I told you I didn't know what to do with it yet, he said. You did. I've had some time to think. 6.5 days on horseback will do that. He looked at her with something that had moved past the careful into something unguarded, which was new enough that she wanted to hold the specific quality of it in her memory accurately. I'm not a simple proposition, Clara. I carry things that don't put down easily and I won't pretend they do. Thomas carried things. She met his eyes steadily. I'm acquainted with the proposition. I know. The lamp on the shelf gave one of its small variations of light. I think Thomas Reed would have had opinions about this situation. He would have had opinions about everything. She set down the cup. He would have liked you. That's what I think. He liked men who didn't explain themselves unless they had something actual to say. She paused, and he would have told me to stop making decisions for both of us about what the coffee means and say what I actually mean. He waited. Stay. She said it simply because the simple version was the true one. Not for the water barrels, not for Ford or coal or any debt you think you owe a dead man. Stay because it's where you should be, and because I'm asking. He was quiet for the kind of moment that is doing work rather than filling space. I'll need to fix the north gate hinge properly, he said. I only did it temporarily. I know. And the storage room roof will need attention before the summer rains. I know. I'm saying that I have noticed several things that need doing here, and I would prefer to be the one who does them. His voice had the quality it had when he was being very precise, because the thing being said was worth precision. If that's acceptable, that's acceptable. She picked up the cup and drank the cold coffee because she had made it and it was there. There's a larger bedroom. You don't have to sleep on the narrow cot. He nodded. Once. Final in the way that decisions are final when they have been properly made rather than arrived at by default. They sat in the kitchen with the lamps low, and the wind doing its patient work on the outside of the building, and Reed's station quiet around them, and it was not a dramatic thing, which was correct, because the dramatic things had already happened, and this was what lived on the other side of them, which was simply two people in a room that had been cold for a long time, beginning the slow work of becoming warm. 6 months later, Rimrock held a celebration for the new water distribution system in the town square. Harlan Masters had returned in May, without Warren Cole's narrative in his ear, and with the deal itself still structurally sound, and he and Clara and Ginny Stone had spent 3 drafts arriving at a contract in which Clara retained ownership of the property, and the Source and Masters provided the capital for the infrastructure. The system now served 7 draw points throughout the town. The water kept flowing. It was September, and the evening was cool, and the whole of Rimrock had turned out along with families from ranches and settlements as far as 40 miles in every direction who had heard the story of Reed's Station and wanted to see the place where it had happened. Ezra McIntosh spoke for approximately 45 seconds, which was long for Ezra, and said that Thomas Reed had built something worth building, and that Clara Reed had held it when holding. It was the hardest available option, and that Rimrock was not the town it was because of the people who had tried to own it, but because of the people who had refused to leave it. 2 weeks before the celebration, in the kitchen at the end of an ordinary morning, Clara had told Buck what she had been carrying for 6 weeks without yet saying. He had sat still for a long moment, which she expected. Then he had gone outside and stood at the fence line looking at the mesa with the full morning sky above it, which she also expected because she had learned that he needed the full size of a thing to receive a thing of full size. He came back in after 10 minutes and poured his coffee and sat down and looked at her with something completely unguarded in his face. The same quality she had first seen the evening he told her about Margaret and the canyon and the 8 years of carrying what he had carried. Thomas, he said, if it's a boy. She had been thinking the same thing, and Margaret, if it's a girl. He nodded once, drank his coffee, and that was the whole of it, which was exactly the right amount. In the town square in September, standing next to Buck while Ezra spoke, Clara felt the particular quality of a thing that has come through difficulty and arrived somewhere that deserved arriving. Not an ending, more like the specific moment when the ground beneath your feet proves itself to be actually ground, which is different from knowing intellectually that it should hold your weight. And different, again, from having stood long enough on uncertain ground that solidity, when it comes, has a texture you can feel through the soles of your boots. Buck's hand found hers in the crowd, did not squeeze, did not announce itself, simply arrived where it arrived and stayed, which was entirely consistent with everything else about him. And she held it in the ordinary way of a person holding something they have decided to keep. The thing Thomas had built was still standing. She was still standing. These two facts occupied the same space in her chest without crowding each other, which was, she had come to understand, as good a definition of the future as she was likely to find, and sufficient.